Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to talk about language and society from Artisan's Linguistics book by Jean Artisan. We are from 19dB class for Introduction to Language course, and our group consists of Desya, Putri, Ramadina, Ibnu Agil, and Rifa'atul Mahmudah. In this material, language and society, we are going to concern with social linguistics, which analyzes variation within a language. It looks at differences between speech and writing, pronunciation between different social classes, divergence men's and women's language, and multilingual communities and pidgins and creoles. Social linguistics is often defined as the study of language and society. Social linguists are interested in language differences, and especially in variation within a particular language. We are going to talk about 12 topics. There are the notion of a language, dialect and accent, from high to low, speech versus writing, charting phonological variation in British English, social networks, language and sex, power talking, change in language styles, multilingual communities.
The first one is the notion of language.
Notion language can't be defined from geographic or nationally because there is similar language like American English and Australian English. But notion language can be defined as speech.
The next is dialect and accent.
Dialect and accent. In this section, we will differentiate between dialect and accent. Dialect is usually associated with some geographical area, but dialect has a greater difference than mere pronunciation.
And now we are going to talk about from high to low.
From high to low. Language variation, it can be noted from social status back in the day, but high and low only matter of politeness now, where high usually used when formal situation and low.
The fourth is speech versus writing.
Speech versus written. There's typical differences between spoken and written, whereas spoken is usually inexplicit with simple structure and only fragments, but written always inexplicit and full of sentences.
Now we are going to talk about charting phonological variation. Speakers vary not only their vocabulary and syntax, but also the sound structure. Phonological variation, both between speakers and within a single speaker, is important as a reflection of various social factors. Speakers of a language alter their phonology to suit a particular situation, often without realizing it. For example, someone from Devon is likely to pronounce the R in a word, such as farm, when chatting with friends at home or in informal situations, but would probably attempt to express it in a formal interview in London. In this case, the speaker may well be aware of the change in pronunciation. On the other hand, few speakers of standard British English realize that in informal situations they often omit the T at the end of words, such as last, in phrases such as. And now, we are going to show an American sociolinguist. He is William Leboeuf. In a piece of work, he examined the pronunciation of words such as car, park in New York. Although Labov was unable to tell which words were likely to be pronounced with R and which without, he found that he could predict the percentage of R sounds, which is socioeconomic class and each age group would use in any given type of speech. Labov started his work on R in a highly amusing way. First, he found out which departments were on the fourth floor in 3 New York department stores. He then asked as many shop assistants as possible a question such as, "Excuse me, where are children's coats?" The answer to each of these queries was, of course, on the fourth floor, which included two words that could. It is well known that sales staff tend to mimic the speech of their customers, and as Labov predicted, he found that in the store that was considered socially inferior, the number of R sounds was low, under 20%. In the middle-ranking store, R was inserted about 50% of the time, and in the store considered socially superior, R was used over 60% of the time. These preliminary results clearly showed that the use of R in New York was a useful guide to social status. After this preliminary survey, Labov then examined the speech of each class of person in more detail. Perhaps predictably, he found that R was inserted much more frequently in careful speech and in the reading of word lists than in casual speech. This was true of all social classes. There was, however, one unexpected finding. When reading word lists, lower middle class speakers inserted R more often than upper middle class speakers. Even though in casual speech, the situation was reversed, with lower middle class speech containing fewer R sounds. This suggests that lower middle class speakers are more consciously aware of speech as an indicator of social class and are making efforts to improve their status. Now, we are going to talk about phonological variation in British English. In England, a similar state of affairs has been found in the speech of people living in Norwich. Consider the differing pronunciations of words ending in ing. Sometimes Norwich inhabitants pronounce the ing as in standard English, for example, talking, and at other times pronounce the ing with an instead of for example. And this is the illustration of the Norwich social situation. First of all, and predictably, the proportion of ing forms was much higher in careful speech than in casual speech for all social classes. For example, those classified as lower working class used ing around 70% of the time when they were asked to read word lists, but hardly ever in casual speech. On the other hand, middle-class speakers used ing 100% of the time in word lists, but only around 70% of the time in casual speech. Second, and perhaps surprisingly, upper working class Norwich inhabitants were found to behave in a very similar way to lower middle class New Yorkers. For this social group, there was an enormous discrepancy between the type of speech used in word lists. ing occurred 95% of the time, and that used in casual speech, ing occurred only 13% of the time. Once again, speakers with a relatively low social status appear. A further analysis of the use of ing by upper working class speakers revealed an unexpected sex difference. Women were found to use ing more often than men. This suggests that change from above, Labov's term for changes of which speakers are consciously aware, may well be initiated mainly by women. There is further evidence that other changes are taking place from below, that is, below the level of conscious awareness. Now, we are going to talk about social. In practice, people do not normally live in such clear-cut layers. Someone from the so-called working class might well have middle-class friends and neighbors. In fact, human beings tend to cluster into social networks, groups of people who regularly interact with one another. A detailed study of the social networks within one particular speech community can provide a useful corrective to label type studies, which tend to suggest humans are rigidly stratified. Network studies can provide a more realistic picture of the way people interact in real life. Furthermore, if a social linguist manages to be introduced into a network, its members are more likely. And now we are going to show the British linguists. They are James and Leslie Milroy. James and Leslie Milroy pioneered the linguistic study of social networks with a study of three communities in Belfast. Leslie was introduced into each group as a friend of a friend. This ensured that she was accepted and that people would talk. Now we are going to talk their findings. When the Milroys examined their data, they discovered a number of things which would not have been detectable in a lab-type survey. For example, Labor's work suggested that men and women's speech tended to differ, with women on the whole being closer to the prestige norm. The Milroys found this pattern also in Belfast overall, but with some interesting subtleties. When Leslie examined the three communities separately and charted the occurrence of the way A was pronounced by people of different ages and both sexes, she found some modification of the overall pattern. In the eldest, most tightly knit and most traditional community, she found that the predicted pattern of male-female difference was most prominent. But in the other two, which were newer and fairly loose-knit, this pattern was less evident. And now we are going to talk about language and sex. Possible sex differences in language usage have recently attracted a lot of attention. First, we need to sort out whether women really do speak differently from men. People's impressions are not necessarily correct. It is often assumed, for example, that women talk more than men, whereas almost all research on the topic has demonstrated the opposite, that men talk more than women. Similarly, it is sometimes claimed that women use empty adjectives, such as divine, charming, cute, yet this type of descriptions is possibly more usually used by presumably male in popular newspapers to describe women. The most consistent difference found between men and women within the Western world is a tendency for women to speak in a way that is closer to the prestige standard. For example, women may be pressurized by society to behave in a ladylike manner, and speak nicely may be part of this. Or because they are the main child rearers, they may subconsciously speak in a way which will enable their children to
Number 9. Power talking. Powerful speakers typically control the topic, interrupt others, and demand explicit explanation. Power talking may be used by either sex, though it is more typically male. Male speakers not only talk more, they also interrupt more. Men used explicit commands in about one-third of the directives. For example, lie down and take off your shoes and socks. but women prefer to phrase commands as joint actions. For example, maybe we should just take the top of your dress off. Maybe what we ought to do is stay with the those you're on. The next is change in language styles. In Latin, there was a singular form tu and a plural form vos. It gradually became customary for a working class person to address a member of the aristocracy as vos, while the upper classes still used tu to a lower class individual. This linguistic situation reflected the social situation. There existed a feudal society in which the power of one class over another was all important. Now look at the table. Upper class to upper class is using vos. Upper class to lower class is using tu. But lower class to upper class is using vos and lower class to lower class is using tu. Vos, as it claimed, came to be not so much a mark of respect as one of non-intimacy, and tu came to be thought of as indicating intimacy, companionship, and solidarity. A power to solidarity shift is taking place worldwide. In that situation, people have become friendlier to one another and are less impressed by authority. But nowadays, this is dying out. Reciprocal relations are gradually becoming more important than the power of one person over another, and members of Indian families are beginning to address one another with intimate you forms. Part 11. Multilingual Communities. I speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse, is saying attributed to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. As this quotation suggests, a phenomenon known as code switching. Code switching is a change of social situation to the actual language spoken. These multiple languages are used is particularly important for language planning. Language planning is a situation in which a government or education manipulate the linguistic situation in a particular direction. Multilingual societies in which all the speakers are proficient in all the languages spoken are something of a rarity. The artificial language, Esperanto, is sometimes proposed as a candidate for a word lingua franca. The last is Pidgins and Creoles. A pidgin is a restricted language system which arises in order to fulfill essential communication needs among people with no common language. For example, Tok Pisin, as Melanesian Pidgin English and Neo-Melanesian, which is spoken in Papua New Guinea, is based on English, and many of the words sound somewhat like English ones. For examples, me go long town, or I go or went to the town. And the second example, you walk about long road, or you walk or walked along the road. The language has become a Creole if someone acquires Pidgin as a first language, perhaps because of intermarriage between people whose only common language is the Pidgin. The study of Pidgins and Creoles has grown rapidly because their implications and interests spread far beyond sociolinguistics. Some people have claimed that they present language in a stripped down and basic state.
That is all for our explanation. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.